This is the most important update that I've yet recorded on coronavirus and the pandemic. The science journal The Lancet has just published a study based on the actual people exposed, the first wave of people in the Wuhan province in China. The study was published yesterday, well, at least as of the time I'm recording this, and it was funded by the Chinese government. Now, the findings of the study are mind-blowing in terms of consequences for humanity. According to this study, the coronavirus has now hit a 15% fatality rate and an 83% infection rate. These numbers are almost unheard of for infectious diseases, especially those with very long incubation periods. And I'll explain why this is critical to understand, because if these numbers hold true, and by the way, this is an early study, it's a small sample size, I think 41 people were studied. So maybe the numbers will settle when there's a larger sample size, but based on this initial study published in The Lancet, I guess an emergency publishing schedule or something, based on these numbers, humanity is going to suffer hundreds of millions of casualties if this is not controlled. And I was just alerted right before I started recording this from my team in Taiwan. They just heard that Guangdong province has just been locked down with a quarantine in China, which means the quarantine is spreading across China and approaching Hong Kong. And they may lock down Hong Kong. In fact, the quarantine is just spreading like wildfire. It's out of control. The quarantine is spreading as fast as the coronavirus itself. There are some bombshell findings from the study. And I want to, again, I have to put out the disclaimer, this is an early study. These numbers may not hold true with a larger sample size, but based on what we have right now, if you do the math, it means 12 out of every 100 people who are exposed will die. Now, 12 out of 100 people die. Okay, how do I get that number? That's 15% times 83%. That's 12. So 15% fatality rate, 83% infection rate. It means 12 out of every, or actually it's 12.45, but who's counting the 4.5? It's 12, we'll say 12 people out of every 100 who are exposed die. Now, how many people are there in the world? Over 7 billion. If this gets out to the whole world, what will happen? Does that mean 12 out of every 100 people in the entire world will die? Well, no, because the virus is going to be more effective in certain areas. These types of viruses, they like warm, humid environments, and they don't do very well in cold climates. So when you look at where this would be, where would it have the most transmissibility? And remember, in this study, by the way, or maybe I didn't mention this, it's got up to an 8-day incubation period. 8 days. No symptoms. And then boom, suddenly you're full blown. But during those 8 days, you may have been spreading it to other people inadvertently. So the long incubation period, high fatality rate of 15% and very high transmissibility rate of 83%, it's going to affect the people who live in regions near the equator. Those are the warmer regions, more humid regions. So we're talking about India. We're talking about southern China. We're talking about, the Philippines, much of the Middle East, northern Africa, well, much of Africa, and of course a whole lot of Central America, South America, parts of Mexico, and maybe southern United States. Those would be the areas that would most likely be affected. I mean, you think about the climate in Florida, or Louisiana, or Mississippi, or eastern Texas, or what have you, Southern California. Los Angeles is the perfect climate for this virus to spread. And I don't know how many people live in Los Angeles, but let's say it's just 10 million people. If you've got 10 million people in Los Angeles and this thing spreads throughout LA, based on these early numbers, and I'm not predicting this, by the way, don't quote me as a prediction. This is a projection based on numbers, but if those numbers were to hold true, there would be 1.2 million deaths in Los Angeles alone if the population of LA is 10 million and if it spreads with the same numbers that we're seeing published in the Lancet. Can you imagine 1.2 million people dying in just LA? And now you might say, well, what about New York? Well, New York is colder. New York's climate is different. New York would not be as subjected to this as Los Angeles. Climate matters. Coastal regions tend to have more temperate climates. So you look at the coastal regions of Oregon and Washington and Seattle. Could Seattle be impacted by this? Absolutely. It is the right climate for this to spread. But if you go inland into eastern Washington, the climate's very different. Or eastern Oregon or even eastern California, or get into Nevada and so on. The climate's very different. Very dry in Arizona, for example. Viruses don't tend to do well in very dry climates like that. They like warm, humid, wet environments. That's how they can spread. Now remember, this is a human-to-human transmission virus, already proven. And it spreads through aerosolized body liquids like spit or coughing or sneezing. You can touch your eye. If you've got this virus on your finger, you touch your eye, you're infected. Touch your nose, touch your mouth, you're infected. All right, and then an 83% infection rate for those who are exposed. That means that 83% of the people who walked through the area where there was exposure, 83% of those people got infected and began to multiply the virus. That number will freak out any epidemiologist who looks at this. They have not seen that number before with something with such a long incubation period. And also the Lancet study says that 12% of the survivors suffered permanent heart injury. And secondary infections, by the way, and other complications, difficulty breathing, shortness of breath, chronic fatigue, pain, lots of things. Now, I've talked about this in previous podcasts. And by the way, all these point to this being bioengineered as a weapon. This is a bioweapon system, I believe, that was engineered to target humans. And it was engineered using the strategy of high transmissibility combined with long incubation periods. I've talked about this in previous podcasts. You've heard me talk about this if you've listened to my channel. I talked about this exact point, that the human killer bioweapon system would have to have high transmissibility combined with long incubation periods so that people carry the disease but are not symptomatic at first. And they spread it without showing symptoms. So the transmissibility here of up to 83%, according to this Lancet study, that allows it to spread and bypass all the quarantines and bypass all the checkpoints. And there's something else that we found out from this study that is mind-blowing, maybe horrifying. 2% of the people who were infected showed no fever. 2% is 1 out of 50 people. So for every 100 people who have this condition, this it's actually being called Wuhan pneumonia. We call it coronavirus. Wuhan pneumonia. Two out of 100 people who have this will not be able to be detected at the health stations where they're taking the temperature of people. They do not show respiratory symptoms. They're not coughing, and they have no fever. Instead, they're having symptoms like diarrhea, digestive distress, vomiting, and lack of appetite. Now, if you're listening to this and you're trained as a scientist or an epidemiologist or a virologist or just a statistician, you know that if you start having a pandemic and 2 out of 100 people slip through the screening, then you cannot control the pandemic. You cannot control it. It only takes 1 out of 100. I mean, even less than that. 0.1 out of 100 people would be alarming. But if you have 2 out of 100 people slipping through who themselves may not even know that they are infected, you see. So they're not even going to self-report to a hospital, let's say, because they don't know. They just think, I don't feel so well today. But they're carrying and multiplying coronavirus and spreading it to family members. If you have 2 out of 100, then this is uncontrollable. especially with an 83% infection rate, if that holds true with a larger group. Now, maybe these numbers will shrink. Maybe, let's say it's only a 10% fatality rate, and let's say a 70% infection rate. Well, that means 7 out of 100 people who are exposed to this are dead, right? Because 10% of 70 is 7. So we're starting to get into some of the numbers of what's the range of what might happen here. Now, let's do some rough math here, because math is fun. Yeah, I'm kind of a math geek. But let's say that 7+ billion people in the world. Let's say that 3 billion of those people live near the equator. It's probably actually a higher number, and it kind of depends on how close to the equator you define it. But let's just say about 3 billion people live close to the equator. And let's say that these numbers in the Lancet journal are high. And let's say that instead of 12 out of 100 being killed, which is the 15% times 83%, let's say it's only 10. Let's say 10% of the people who are exposed to this end up dead. All right, so you got 3 billion people, let's say, living near the equator all around the world. Well, 10% of 3 billion people. If this infection spreads through those regions that I mentioned earlier, what's 10% of 3 billion people? It's 300 million people dead. And those are conservative numbers for what's published in the Lancet. 300 million people dead around the world. So I ask you, think on your own, what does that mean for the world economy? What does that mean for food production? Much of the food for the United States comes from Mexico, Central America, Brazil, Bolivia, places that are likely to be strongly impacted by this. If they lose 10% of their populations from this, or even anywhere close to that, what kind of economic impact are we talking about? Not just the loss of human life, which is catastrophic by itself. It's almost so large you can't even quantify it emotionally. What would this mean for humanity to lose 10% of the people who live, close to the equator? 300 million people. But what would the economic impact be? And I think the economic impact would be absolutely devastating. And then the reaction to the infections, which would shut down cities and quarantine cities all over the west coast of the United States. In Florida, Miami might be quarantined. Houston might be quarantined. Who knows? And then the logistics and supply problems, no food deliveries. Energy systems shut down, coal deliveries stopped to the power plants feeding the water system in California, in Los Angeles. We've talked about these things before. I don't have to describe everything, all the chain reaction of impacts, but it's catastrophic. It's catastrophic. Let us pray that this journal study is wrong. Let us pray that China gets this under control, and that all the other countries that already have these people get it under control. Let's pray that France contains it, and Taiwan contains it, and the Philippines contains it. And by the way, the Philippines is actually one of the environments that's ideal for the spreading of this pandemic, for its climate reasons and so on, population density in the cities. Lots of reasons. The high density cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, Portland, I've mentioned them, Houston, Miami, whatever. These are highly vulnerable to this disease. And also, Brazil, Peru, Bolivia. You look at the places in South America and Central America, they are all, Panama, ideal environment for this virus to spread. But also look at, the second most populous country in the world is India. And regions of India are ideal for this to spread. Can you imagine the disruption between India and Pakistan and that whole region and China? If this becomes a major pandemic in that region, you already have geopolitical tensions in that area with freaking nuclear weapons. So, what does that mean for geopolitical stability? It's bad news. It's bad news. And then the Middle East. What happens if this gets into the Middle East on top of all the other problems that are happening there right now and the conflict right now? And then Africa. And then, southern France, southern Italy, Spain, parts of the UK that are more temperate in their climate because of winds and ocean currents and so on. You're talking about a really horrifying worst case scenario here for humanity. And the software simulation that was run by that organization funded by Bill and Melinda Gates recently, they ran a simulation of something similar to a coronavirus, but not exactly this strain. That simulation, which has been covered all across the independent media now, predicted 56 million deaths globally from a pandemic getting out. That simulation did not have numbers nearly as high as what we're seeing in the Lancet. That simulation did not use an 83% infection rate or a 15% fatality rate. It used numbers that were way lower. I forgot the exact numbers, but typically fatality rates are under 5% and infection rates are way under 50%. So if that simulation were updated with these numbers, how many deaths would it predict? Probably over 250 million deaths is my guess. Again, I'm not predicting it. I'm just telling you that if they were to update the software and rerun it based on these data, then there's some large numbers, very large numbers. A lot of people will not survive this. Now, people have been asking me, why would China release this? Well, you're assuming that they released it on purpose. The theory that continues to emerge as the most likely theory now, this is kind of my working theory, is that this is a bioengineered weapon against humanity that has been accidentally released in Wuhan province, that they were working on it, according to this theory, they were working on this weapon in the BSL-4 labs, biosafety level 4 laboratories there. China is running or in the process of constructing 5 laboratories that work on this level of biohazards. And they are dual-use laboratories, which means they can develop bioweapons in those labs. In the last 10, 12 years or so, there were 4 documented cases of accidental release of SARS virus from these laboratories. 4 cases. And as I've talked about in other podcasts, the culture of China is one where if you're a low-level worker in a lab, you don't sound the alarm that would embarrass the Communist Party and say, oh, we don't know how to run labs. No, you don't report the problems. What you do, if you're a researcher in that facility and you're researching, you're working with the monkeys. And the monkeys, they infect the monkeys with the bioweapons, right? The monkeys bite and scratch. The monkeys spit. The monkeys are fighting for their lives because they're being used as primate guinea pigs. You'd fight too if you were a monkey. The monkeys scratch the researcher. They puncture the suit. Oh, the virus gets in. Is that researcher going to go to his boss and say, oh, we had an accident. Our lab is in violation of the accreditation standards. We have to shut down this research, blah, blah, blah. No, that researcher is going to slap a piece of duct tape over that hole, and they're going to pretend nothing happened. They're going to go home to their wife and family, and then they're going to celebrate Chinese New Year and travel and celebrate with more family members somewhere else. And that I think, is the most likely scenario of what has happened here. It is an engineered bioweapon that China was planning to release later. Now, I know this might contradict some of my earlier predictions of this. Early on, I thought this was an intentional release, but I'm adapting my view on that based on new information. I now suspect this was an accidental release of an engineered weapon that China was probably going to try to deploy as a weapon against the United States later on by releasing it in a place like the LAX airport, let's say, or the Miami airport or what have you. 12 monkeys. It's the 12 monkeys scenario right there. Walk through the airport. Yeah, here. Sniff this vial, Mr. TSA security guy. while you're patting down my crotch. Go ahead and sniff this vial. 12 monkeys just happened. That's the scenario that probably was, China was working toward, because China, they are the enemy of America. They want to destroy America. This is the weapon that can do it, but they accidentally released it in their own backyard. And the whole seafood market explanation, it's a cover story. It's a cover story. They're not going to say, oh, our lab screwed up and released this bioweapon that we've been working on for 8 years. The perfect weapon for destroying humanity. Long incubation period, high transmission rate, and very high fatality rate. They're not going to admit that they accidentally released that. You know what the repercussions would be on the global stage if they admitted that? No, they're going to blame the seafood market. Oh, it's the fish. It's the shrimp. Oh, it's that chick that eats bats. Which is freaking gross, by the way. Who the hell eats bats? They force her to apologize? To go on TV and apologize for eating bats. You see, they got to have a scapegoat. Or in this case, a scape bat. That woman's going to need a Batmobile to get out of her bat cave. She's in so much trouble. Yeah, they made her the scapegoat because she's been eating bat soup. I mean, again, what kind of crazy psycho runs around eating bats anyway? I don't know, but they're Chinese communists, They don't believe in God either, but they love biting the heads off bats. It's like a 1970s rock and roll band, That's what it's like. Craziness. But they just built the world's most devastating biological weapon, a self-replicating weapon, and then I think they accidentally released it in their own backyard. So such is the downside of researching bioweapons, by the way. Yeah, you're playing with fire there, commies, you Chinese commies. You are begging to be destroyed. You build a weapon, that weapon may be used against you, almost as a biblical principle. From what I can tell, this is the most likely scenario. Can't prove it, but just trying to put the pieces of this puzzle together. Hey, my analysis might change as we get more information, but that's the best that we can see right now. Because I don't think there's anything in nature that does this, not with these numbers. You look at Ebola, and a lot of people think that a bioweapon would have a very high fatality rate. That's what will wipe out humanity. No, I've tried to teach people about this. High fatality rate, short incubation period, that does not spread because people bleed out too fast. Ebola, everybody can see you a mile away because you're flinging blood all over the place with your convulsions. You got blood coming out of your eyeballs and ears and mouth and rectum, by the way. It's a gross situation. Ebola, you're flinging blood all over the place. That's not stealth. That's not, you can't sneak that through an airport checkpoint. So that's not a bioweapon that is going to be effective on the scale that this coronavirus may be effective. They wanted a stealth virus, one that would be a secret, like secret luggage on your trip. How many carry-ons are allowed on this airplane? Only one, but I got 1 billion viruses. The most effective weapon is one that's stealth. Long incubation period. Hidden symptoms, like 2 out of 100 people not having a fever. Oh, it can bypass the checkpoints. It can spread without people knowing it. It can incubate for 8 days in your family members. Or, as it is in Asia, these businessmen go on trips over to different countries, and they hire prostitutes all the time. They hire prostitutes in Vietnam, and prostitutes in Korea, and prostitutes in Thailand, and it's a lot of prostitution among Asian men throughout Asia, throughout the region, and they go on business trips and then they sleep with prostitutes. You think semen contains coronavirus? Yep, you bet it does. You can bet on it. I haven't seen any studies on that yet, but you can bet it does. It's in saliva. It's going to be in the semen. Just like Ebola was found in semen. In fact, there was a study that talked about Ebola virus still being present in semen 6 months after people were free of Ebola symptoms. Imagine that. What if coronavirus maintains viability in semen for 6 months after a person shows no symptoms? So they think they're cured. They go out on a quote business trip and sleep with some, prostitute in one of these countries, and they're infecting them with coronavirus. See? It's the perfect weapon system to take out the global economy is what this is going to do. A depopulation weapon, maybe a military strategic weapon. I don't know I don't know the real plan behind it, but it's clearly developed to kill human beings. And that's consistent with the aims of the globalists that we've already talked about. So if you understand these things, if you understand the fatality rate, the infection rate, the epidemiology, the stealth symptoms, you understand the limitations of infectious disease screening systems by health authorities around the world, airports, train stations, roadways, then you will inevitably come to the conclusion they cannot contain this. And if they cannot contain it, and I hope I'm wrong about that, but if they cannot contain it, it means it's going to spread in America eventually. It's going to spread through cities like Los Angeles and Seattle and Miami and Houston. And it means that quarantines are coming. Quarantines are coming. Martial law is coming if this holds true, which means supply disruptions are coming. And all the things that we've talked about in other podcasts over the last 3 years, actually even longer, it's all coming. And yet, most of America sleeps. They're more interested in, what are they interested in now? Snapchat, Starbucks, fashion, travel, cooking shows. Oh, look, that Chinese man is making a fried rice dish with limes in it. Instead of going out and getting supplies that they should be getting to survive. Instead of watching food on TV, maybe you should be stockpiling some food. You know what I mean? That's just a little piece of advice from someone who I've been a prepper since, the 1990s, I guess. I've been prepping for over 20 years, and I still don't feel like I'm prepared enough for this. So I'll just leave it at that. I'll have more updates for you. But this doesn't look good. China's panicking. They're expanding their quarantines like crazy. Tells us that they don't have a hold of this thing. And if they don't have a hold of it, and all the travel out of China, it's already in other countries all over. How are they going to contain this? It doesn't look good. But we'll see. Maybe a miracle will occur, and maybe we'll get lucky. But I doubt it, because we've created the perfect storm for all the conditions to spread this disease, like the filthy liberal cities like I've covered before, feces in the streets of San Francisco, and rapid international travel, compromise immune systems because people are overly vaccinated, makes their immune systems weak, so they can't even handle this without becoming infected and then spreading it to others. So, yeah. Humanity's about to face a day of reckoning, some serious consequences for what has been put into place. Maybe Judgment Day has been unleashed. Judgment Day. Maybe we should call it the Judgment Coronavirus, like the Terminator Judgment Day. Sarah Connor. But I'll try to keep you posted as best I can. Mike Adams here, the Health Ranger, publisher of NaturalNews.com. You can hear my podcasts at HR Report. That's the channel name, HR Report, at Brighteon.com. I pray for your safety. Pray for mine. There'll be a lot of survivors. 90% of the human race will survive, or maybe 95%. I don't know. But there's going to be a lot of people that die if this doesn't get under control very quickly. God bless you. Thank you for listening.